The first thing Hazel Whitaker heard that morning was not the winter wind. It was a wolf crying somewhere beyond the frozen pines. The sound lingered only a heartbeat before silence swallowed it. Yet something inside her refused to forget it. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now back to Hazel. Frostpine Pack awoke beneath a sky the color of cold steel as villagers hurried through fresh snow, polishing banners, sweeping stone paths, and preparing for the arrival of the Alpha King. Excitement rippled through every household. Royal inspections rarely reached such distant territories, and everyone believed a single favorable impression could change a family's future. Hazel expected nothing to change for hers. At 22, she owned little beyond a weathered satchel of herbs, a patched winter cloak, and the quiet skills Mabel Crane had spent years teaching her. While young wolves trained with swords and sharpened claws, Hazel learned how to stop bleeding, calm frightened animals, and sit beside those who suffered until fear slowly loosened its grip. Most of Frostpine considered those talents too gentle to matter. Hazel never tried to convince them otherwise. She simply continued wherever she was needed. Mabel often reminded her that healing was not measured by applause, but by the lives still breathing when morning came. Hazel carried those words more faithfully than any family heirloom. As she crossed the kennel yard with fresh bandages tucked beneath one arm, a panicked patrol wolf thrashed beneath a collapsed supply sled, its hind leg trapped between broken timbers. Stable hands circled nervously, unwilling to approach the terrified animal. "It'll bite," someone muttered. "Leave it for the handlers." Hazel set down her basket without hesitation. She crouched several feet away, allowing the frightened wolf to scent her before speaking in a voice scarcely louder than falling snow. The snarling gradually faded. Its trembling slowed. Only then did Hazel slide the splintered wood aside and free the injured limb. She wrapped the swollen leg carefully, ignoring the cold soaking through her gloves. When she finished, the wolf rested its head briefly against her shoulder before limping away. A few workers exchanged uneasy looks. They had seen wounded wolves obey experienced trainers before. They had never seen one surrender its fear so completely to someone with no authority at all. The quiet moment shattered beneath a crisp laugh. Marissa Caldwell descended the stone steps wearing an elegant white cloak lined with silver fur, every movement announcing confidence born from privilege. "How touching," she said, loud enough for nearby workers to hear. "Perhaps His Majesty has traveled across the Northern Territory searching for a kennel girl instead of a future Luna." Laughter followed her words. Hazel lowered her eyes and reached for her basket. She had learned long ago that defending herself only gave cruel people a longer audience. Marissa drifted closer, then casually brushed the basket aside with her boot. Glass vials burst across the frozen ground. Dried herbs disappeared beneath muddy footprints before Hazel could rescue them. Jonah Reeves took one uncertain step forward, then stopped as other wolves watched. Mabel arrived moments later, placing a gentle hand upon Hazel's shoulder before kneeling beside the scattered medicine. "Leave these," the old healer said softly. "Some losses teach us where to gather our strength." Hazel looked at the ruined herbs, then quietly nodded. At that very instant, a deep horn rolled across the valley. Every conversation ended. Children stopped running. Even the patrol wolves lifted their heads toward the northern pass. Black royal banners emerged through drifting snow, and somewhere beyond the trees, a second sound answered the horn, a single powerful howl unlike anything Hazel had ever heard. It carried neither threat nor rage. It sounded like an ancient promise echoing through the mountains, and for reasons she could not explain, Hazel felt certain it had been searching for someone long before it reached Frostpine. The procession moved like a dark river through the white wilderness, its riders wrapped in black cloaks embroidered with the silver crest of the Northern Crown. Frostpine's villagers bowed as one, their confidence dissolving beneath the weight of royal authority. Hazel remained beside Mabel Crane near the infirmary entrance, her hands folded tightly to hide the sting left by the morning's humiliation. She had no reason to expect anyone from the royal court would ever notice an overlooked Omega whose days were spent mending wounds that others ignored. Then she saw him. Callan Westbrook rode at the center without unnecessary display, mounted upon a towering midnight stallion whose steady pace carried the quiet certainty of absolute command. He was not dressed like the extravagant rulers painted in old murals. His heavy coat bore no jewels, only practical leather fastenings dusted with snow, yet every wolf lowered their gaze before his silver eyes swept across the square. There was something unsettling about his composure. It was not cruelty. It was the burden of a man who measured every decision against the lives of thousands. Graham Fletcher guided several royal guards into formation, while Derek Hensley hurried forward to deliver his report, eager to display flawless discipline before the king. Marissa Caldwell followed only a few steps behind, every graceful movement carefully calculated, offering respectful greetings while making certain she remained within Callan's line of sight. The Alpha King acknowledged her with a brief nod before turning toward the surrounding forest instead, as though listening to a sound no one else could hear. A low murmur spread through the gathered crowd. From between towering pines emerged a creature unlike anything Hazel had imagined. Its coat shimmered with silver-white strands beneath the pale sky, each measured stride silent despite its enormous size. The great wolf carried itself with ancient dignity rather than aggression, amber eyes surveying the valley with quiet intelligence older than memory itself. Oral walked beside Callan instead of behind him, not as a servant, but as an equal guardian. Every wolf instinctively stepped backward, overcome by reverence. Hazel felt her own heartbeat slow for reasons she could not explain. As Oral passed the assembled pack, the immense wolf suddenly paused. Its head lifted. The sharp, golden gaze drifted through dozens of faces before settling directly upon Hazel. Time seemed to loosen around her. She neither moved nor spoke. The distance between them held only falling snow and a silence that pressed gently against her chest. Instead of baring fangs or displaying dominance, Oral lowered his great head by the smallest measure. It lasted only a heartbeat before the creature resumed walking beside Callan as though nothing unusual had happened. Hazel wondered whether exhaustion had played tricks upon her senses. Yet Mabel's fingers quietly tightened around her sleeve. The elderly healer said nothing, but concern flickered across her weathered face. Before Hazel could ask why, Derek cleared his throat loudly. "Your Majesty," he announced. "Our scouts discovered unusual tracks leading toward the ice ravine before sunrise. We believe rogues may be testing the eastern border." Graham exchanged a brief glance with Callan. Neither man appeared surprised. "Prepare a search party," Callan ordered calmly. "No delays." His words were few, yet every soldier immediately obeyed. Mabel leaned closer to Hazel after the officers dispersed. "Gather winter salves, fresh linen, splints, and dried willow bark," she instructed. "If they expect injuries, they'll need every capable pair of hands." Hazel blinked in surprise. Surely someone else would be more useful. Mabel's expression remained firm. Healing is never measured by rank. Across the courtyard, Marissa overheard the exchange, a faint smile touching her lips before she approached Derek. Their hushed conversation disappeared beneath the rising wind, but Hazel noticed the captain glance toward her with open dissatisfaction. It was the same look reserved for problems waiting to happen. Within the hour, sleds were loaded, ropes inspected, and weapons secured against the bitter cold. Hazel climbed quietly into the final supply wagon beside bundles of medicine, unaware that high above the valley, fresh cracks had already begun spreading beneath the ancient ice that guarded the ravine beyond the northern ridge. The sleds departed Frostpine before the weak winter sun had climbed above the jagged peaks, leaving the village behind beneath a blanket of drifting white. Frost coated every pine branch, and the only sounds were the runners scraping across packed snow and the distant cries of mountain hawks circling overhead. Hazel Whitaker sat near the rear beside crates of medicines, keeping one gloved hand over the satchel Mabel Crane had packed herself. Every bottle, needle, and bundle of herbs had its place. The old healer had trusted her with lives before, but never beyond the safety of the settlement. Today felt different, as though the mountains themselves were waiting. Graham Fletcher rode near the front beside Alpha King Callan Westbrook, scanning every ridge without wasting a single movement. Their conversation remained quiet, spoken between men who needed few words after years of shared campaigns. Ahead of them padded Oral, his broad paws leaving perfect impressions across untouched snow, while his amber eyes swept endlessly from cliff to forest. No ordinary predator moved with such deliberate purpose. Even the horses seemed calmer whenever the great wolf passed nearby. Derek Hensley repeatedly urged the company forward, eager to reach the eastern border before daylight faded. Each time Hazel glanced toward him, she noticed his attention lingered less upon the trail than upon Callan himself, as though every decision were another opportunity to prove his worth. Marissa Caldwell remained equally determined. Riding a pale mare several lengths behind the Alpha King, she asked polished questions about border defenses, ancient treaties, and neighboring pacts, carefully shaping every sentence to sound intelligent without challenging royal authority. Callan answered only when necessary. Courtesy never became invitation. After several hours, the forest began to thin, revealing towering walls of blue ice rising beyond the trees. The temperature dropped sharply. Breath crystallized almost instantly, and the wind carried an unfamiliar scent that caused Oral to stop. The immense wolf lowered his head, nostrils widening before he turned toward a narrow valley hidden between fractured cliffs. Graham immediately signaled the column to halt. Several guards dismounted while Derek hurried ahead to inspect the area. Fresh tracks, he called back after kneeling beside the snow. 3, perhaps 4 wolves. They crossed sometime before dawn. Callan approached without haste, studying the prints before shifting his attention toward the surrounding rock faces. Too orderly, he murmured. Rogues don't travel like this. Hazel could not hear every word, yet she noticed Graham's expression tighten. Something about the trail disturbed even the king's most trusted commander. As preparations continued, Hazel climbed from the supply sled to check a horse whose foreleg trembled from the bitter climb. While soothing the frightened animal, she heard a faint sound carried beneath the wind. It resembled a distant groan, low and uneven, as though the mountain itself had drawn a painful breath. She looked toward the frozen cliffs. Thin silver lines stretched across the ancient ice before disappearing beneath fresh snowfall. Her pulse quickened. She had seen smaller fractures near frozen rivers during childhood. Those cracks had always widened without warning. Hazel quietly approached Graham. "Sir," she said carefully, "I believe the ice ahead may be unstable." Before the captain could answer, Derek stepped between them with open irritation. "Stay with the supplies," he snapped. "Leave scouting to wolves who understand these mountains." Heat touched Hazel's cheeks, but she refused to argue. Graham glanced once toward the cliffs, then back toward Hazel, storing her warning without dismissing it. Callan had already begun following Oral deeper into the valley. The great wolf no longer tracked ordinary footprints. His ears stood rigid, body tense, every instinct fixed upon something hidden beyond the next ridge. Suddenly, Oral released a single powerful growl that echoed across the frozen wilderness. Hundreds of birds burst from the pines. Snow cascaded from towering ledges high above. Callan's hand lifted instantly, ordering everyone to stop where they stood. Then, from somewhere ahead beyond the narrowing passage, came the unmistakable crack of massive ice giving way beneath impossible weight. The mountain did not explode all at once. It failed the way old promises break, first with a whisper, then with a sound no one could stop. A deep groan rolled beneath the frozen valley as thin fractures raced across the ancient ice like silver lightning. Before anyone could react, the entire ledge beneath the scouting party gave way. "Back!" Graham Fletcher shouted, but the warning drowned beneath the deafening roar. Massive sheets of blue ice shattered from the cliffs, crashing into the narrow pass with enough force to throw horses from their footing and overturn supply sleds. Snow surged through the valley in blinding waves, swallowing wolves, stone, and sky alike. Hazel Whitaker dropped beside the nearest boulder, shielding her head while shards struck the frozen ground around her. When the trembling finally eased, silence felt almost unnatural. The trail that had existed moments earlier was gone. Jagged walls of broken ice split the expedition into scattered groups, while a newly opened chasm stretched across the valley where solid ground had once been. Graham was already calling names, counting survivors, directing guards toward stable footing. Derek Hensley climbed from the snow, blood running down one temple as he searched the destruction. Then his face changed. "Where is Oral?" Every voice stopped. Callan Westbrook had already turned toward the shattered ridge, his silver eyes sweeping the devastation with terrifying focus. Oral. The Alpha King's call echoed across the cliffs, carrying far beyond the drifting snow. Nothing answered. Then, from somewhere deep below the broken shelf, came a faint scrape against ice. Barely a sound, barely enough to hear. Hazel lifted her head toward the edge. Fresh claw marks scored the frozen wall before disappearing into the white abyss beneath. She moved closer, ignoring the sharp wind rising from the chasm. Through shifting curtains of snow, she finally saw it. A massive silver form trapped upon a narrow shelf far below, one foreleg pinned beneath collapsed ice. Oral was alive. He tried to lift his head at the distant voices above, but the effort ended in exhausted stillness. "He's breathing," Hazel called. Graham immediately dropped beside the edge, following the direction of her outstretched hand. Even from above, the situation was painfully clear. The shelf supporting Oral had fractured almost completely. Every passing moment widened the cracks around him. Derek stepped beside Graham, studying the impossible distance only briefly before shaking his head. "No one reaches him alive." He faced the king. "Your Majesty, we have to withdraw before the mountain finishes collapsing." Callan never looked away from the ravine. The bond he shared with Oral carried more than loyalty. He could feel the great wolf's pain fading into dangerous exhaustion with every heartbeat. Duty demanded he protect the living wolves still standing around him. Friendship demanded he refuse to abandon the companion who had fought beside him since the day he claimed the Northern Crown. For the first time since entering Frostpine, uncertainty crossed the Alpha King's face. Graham spoke carefully. "If another shelf breaks while someone is climbing." He did not finish. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. More lives would be lost. Hazel looked from one hardened warrior to another. They were not cowards. They were making the logical choice. Yet every logical sentence sounded exactly the same. Too dangerous. Too late. Impossible. Her eyes returned to the lonely figure below. Oral was no longer struggling to escape. He simply lay there, breathing more slowly than before, as though waiting for the world to decide whether he was worth saving. Something inside Hazel broke at that sight. She remembered the frightened patrol wolf that morning, the way fear had disappeared only after someone finally chose to stay instead of walking away. Compassion had never asked whether rescue was convenient. It had only ever asked one question: is there still life? Hazel quietly stepped toward the overturned supply sled and reached for the longest rescue rope. No one noticed at first. All eyes remained fixed on the Alpha King, waiting for his decision. But Hazel had already made hers. No one told Hazel Whitaker to stop. No one told her to go. That silence became the answer she carried to the edge of the ravine. Wind surged upward from the frozen abyss, stinging her face as she pulled the longest rescue rope from the overturned sled. Behind her, soldiers were still arguing over distances, unstable ice, and impossible odds. Hazel heard every word. She simply chose not to let any of them become the last thing Oral heard. Mabel Crane reached her first. The old healer caught Hazel gently by the wrist, her weathered fingers trembling against the young woman's frozen skin. "Child," she whispered, "if you climb down there." Hazel looked into the eyes of the woman who had taught her that every life deserved a chance, no matter how small the hope. She answered with the faintest smile. "Then I'll do what you taught me." Mabel slowly released her hand. There was fear in her expression, but there was also something deeper: acceptance. Hazel tied one end of the rope around the thick trunk of an ancient pine whose roots disappeared deep beneath the frozen earth. She checked every knot twice, exactly as Mabel had taught her years before. Graham Fletcher strode toward her, disbelief crossing his face. "You don't understand what waits below." Hazel tightened the final knot without looking up. "I understand someone is still alive." Before Graham could answer, Derek Hensley stepped between them. "Enough." His voice cut through the valley like steel. "You're an Omega. You don't have the strength for this climb. If you fall, we'll lose another life for nothing." Hazel finally raised her eyes. They were tired, bruised by years of being underestimated, yet remarkably calm. "Maybe," she answered softly. "But if I stay here, he'll certainly die." Derek opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no argument against certainty spoken with such quiet conviction. The wind carried another faint sound from below, a strained breath, barely reaching the surface. Hazel did not hesitate again. She secured the rope around her waist, adjusted the climbing hook hanging from her belt, and stepped toward the broken rim. Hazel. Callan Westbrook's voice stopped her only for a moment. She turned. The Alpha King stood a few paces away, snow gathering across his dark shoulders. The struggle inside his silver eyes was impossible to hide now. As king, he could not order someone to sacrifice herself. As Oral's lifelong companion, he could not bear watching another person descend alone into almost certain death. Without another word, Callan unclipped the heavy forged climbing hook from his own saddle harness and walked toward her. It was worn smooth from years of campaigns, its steel scratched by countless ascents and battles. He placed it carefully into her hands. "This has never failed me," he said quietly. "May it not fail you." Hazel closed her fingers around the cold metal. She understood what he was truly giving her. Not equipment. Trust. She nodded once, unable to find words worthy of the moment. Then she stepped backward over the edge. The mountain swallowed her almost immediately. Above, the sky narrowed into a strip of pale gray while walls of ancient ice surrounded her on every side. Each careful descent demanded absolute concentration. Loose crystals slid beneath her boots. Sharp edges scraped her gloves. More than once the rope lurched as fresh fractures echoed somewhere within the cliff, forcing Hazel to press herself motionless against the frozen wall until the trembling faded. At last her boots touched a narrow shelf no wider than a doorway. Oral lay only a few feet away, half buried beneath shattered ice. Blood darkened the silver fur along his shoulder, and one massive foreleg remained trapped beneath a slab too heavy for him to escape. The great wolf stirred weakly as Hazel approached. His amber eyes opened, clouded by exhaustion, yet still watchful. He made no attempt to growl. Instead, he simply looked at her, as though recognizing the same quiet presence that had calmed frightened wolves back in Frostpine. Hazel knelt beside him, ignoring the bitter cold seeping through her clothes. She slipped off her own wool cloak and tucked it beneath his body to keep him from the unforgiving ice. Then, without a second thought, she tore long strips from the sleeves of her coat and wrapped the bleeding wound with slow, careful hands. "You're going home," she whispered, brushing melting snow from the great wolf's face. "Not because you're a king's companion, because you deserve another sunrise." Oral released a long, weary breath and gently rested the weight of his great head against Hazel's shoulder. For one fragile heartbeat, the ravine became completely still. Then a deep crack rolled through the mountain beneath them. Hazel looked up just as a dark fracture raced across the ice overhead, stretching directly toward the narrow shelf where she and the great wolf now knelt together. The crack above them spread with terrifying speed. Hazel Whitaker barely had time to throw herself across Oral before the frozen wall burst apart. Jagged sheets of blue ice crashed onto the narrow shelf, striking her back and shoulders while splinters scattered into the darkness below. The ledge shuddered violently beneath their combined weight, then settled with an ominous groan. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Hazel forced herself upright, every breath burning through aching ribs. Blood trickled from a cut along her temple, but her eyes searched only for Oral. The great wolf was still alive. The slab imprisoning his foreleg had shifted during the collapse, leaving the stone balanced unevenly against the fractured ice. It was still far too heavy for one person to lift, yet no longer completely beyond hope. Hazel wrapped both hands around the forged climbing hook Callan Westbrook had entrusted to her and drove its curved point beneath the edge of the slab. She planted her boots carefully, remembering Mabel Crane's quiet lessons from years before. Never fight strength with strength. Change the weight. Change the balance. She leaned backward with everything she had. The hook bent. The stone rose barely an inch before slamming back into place. Pain shot through her arms. She closed her eyes for a single heartbeat, drew one slow breath, and tried again. High above the ravine, the rescue rope jerked violently in Callan's hands. Every instinct screamed that the mountain was failing faster than time allowed. One guard looked toward the splintering pine anchoring the line. "Your Majesty, if that tree comes loose, everyone standing here will go over with them." Derek Hensley seized the moment. "Cut the rope," he urged, "before the cliff takes the rest of us." No one answered. Callan's silver eyes never left the line, disappearing into the white abyss. He remembered every campaign Oral had survived beside him, every silent watch beneath winter skies, every battle won because the great wolf had refused to retreat. A king was expected to measure lives with reason rather than emotion. Yet reason had already abandoned the ravine the moment an overlooked Omega climbed down where trained warriors would not. Without speaking, Callan stepped forward and wrapped the rope around his own forearms, taking its full strain upon himself. Graham Fletcher moved beside him an instant later, adding his strength without waiting for orders. One by one, the remaining guards followed. Even those who had doubted Hazel placed their hands upon the line. Below, Hazel felt the stone shift once more. This time it rolled just far enough for Oral to pull his injured foreleg free. The great wolf tried to stand but faltered almost immediately, his wounded shoulder collapsing beneath him. Hazel knelt at once, slipping one arm beneath his neck to steady him. "Easy," she whispered. "You've carried enough." Oral did not struggle again. Instead, he rested against her as though the simple sound of her voice eased something deeper than pain. Hazel's gloved hand absently stroked the thick silver fur along his neck, just as she had comforted frightened wolves back in Frostpine. She never noticed the subtle change. Oral's frantic breathing gradually slowed. The trembling beneath his muscles eased. His rigid posture softened into weary trust. Above, Callan suddenly drew a sharp breath. Through the ancient bond linking him to the great wolf, he felt something impossible. The agony that had consumed Oral only moments before had not vanished, but it was no longer overwhelming. Hope had reached him before rescue ever could. Callan looked toward Mabel. The old healer met his gaze without surprise, only quiet understanding. She gave the smallest nod. No explanation was needed. Every strange moment since arriving in Frostpine now settled into place. The frightened patrol wolf that had yielded to Hazel's touch, Oral stopping in the village square to acknowledge her, the calm now flowing through a bond that no ordinary healer could reach. Yet below, Hazel remained completely unaware. She believed she had done nothing extraordinary. She had simply refused to abandon someone who was still breathing. After securing the rope beneath Oral's chest with careful, practiced knots, she fastened the remaining length around her own waist and tugged twice on the line, the agreed signal that they were ready. Graham immediately ordered the pull. Slowly, painfully, the rope tightened. Hazel and Oral rose together from the shattered shelf. For one hopeful moment, it seemed the mountain had finally surrendered them. Then a thunderous crack split the ravine. The ancient shelf tore away from the cliff, and the full weight of collapsing ice hurled both Hazel and the great wolf out into open air, leaving them suspended above the endless abyss, while the rescue rope screamed under a force no human hands had ever been meant to bear. The world disappeared into motion. Hazel Whitaker felt the rope wrench violently against her waist as she and Oral swung through the freezing void, the broken ledge exploding above them into thousands of glittering shards. For one terrifying instant, she saw nothing beneath her except endless darkness waiting to swallow them both. High above, Callan Westbrook dug his boots into the ice while Graham Fletcher and every remaining guard fought to hold the straining line. Fibers groaned under impossible weight. Derek Hensley shouted that they had to let go before the cliff claimed everyone, but no one moved. Even the soldiers who had doubted Hazel now pulled until blood seeped through their gloves. Below, Hazel crashed hard against the frozen wall. Pain shot through her ribs, nearly stealing her breath. Yet her first instinct was not to check herself. She searched for Oral. The great wolf hung only a few feet away, twisting helplessly as loose ice continued raining around them. Another impact against the cliff could reopen his wounds or snap the rope completely. Fighting dizziness, Hazel reached across the gap and caught hold of the harness binding him. Her fingers had almost no strength left, but she wrapped both arms around the thick straps, steadying his body against hers so the violent swinging slowly eased. Oral lifted weary amber eyes to meet hers. There was no fear in them now, only profound trust. The moment Hazel pressed her forehead gently against the great wolf's neck, warmth unlike anything she had ever known spread through her hands. It flowed quietly, without light or spectacle, like sunlight sinking into frozen earth after a long winter. The blood matting Oral's shoulder did not vanish, nor did impossible miracles occur. Instead, his frantic breathing settled into a steadier rhythm, His muscles relaxed, and the wild agony that had filled his gaze since the avalanche finally softened. Above the ravine, Callan staggered as something familiar washed through the ancient bond he had shared with Oral since the wolf had first chosen him years before. The crushing panic, the relentless pain, the certainty of losing his oldest companion, all of it eased. Not disappeared, but lifted enough for hope to return. His silver eyes widened as understanding struck with breathtaking clarity. He turned toward Mabel Crane, whose weathered face carried neither surprise nor triumph, only quiet acceptance. "You knew," Callan said. Mabel lowered her head. "I knew she carried a gift she never understood. She never healed with power. She healed because suffering answered something inside her that she could never ignore." Callan looked back into the abyss. Every strange moment now aligned with perfect logic. The patrol wolf that had calmed beneath Hazel's touch, Oral pausing in the village square to acknowledge her, the invisible relief that had reached him through their shared bond only moments earlier. None of it had been chance. Yet Hazel herself remained completely unaware. She believed she was simply holding a wounded creature who deserved one more chance to live. The realization struck Callan harder than any battlefield victory or defeat. Everything she had risked had been offered freely, expecting nothing in return. At that same moment, another sharp crack echoed through the ravine. The anchor buried within the ancient pine began tearing loose from the frozen ground. Graham saw it first. "The tree is giving way," he shouted. Every guard threw their weight backward, but the earth itself had begun collapsing beneath them. Hazel looked upward as snow poured from the cliffs once more. She understood instantly. The rope would never hold both her and Oral through another collapse. Without allowing herself time to think, she reached toward the knot securing her own harness. If one life had to be released to save the other, she had already decided which one it would be. Before her frozen fingers could untie the buckle, Oral suddenly twisted with the last of his strength, planting one enormous paw firmly against Hazel's chest, not to push her away, but to stop her from making the sacrifice she believed no one would ever know she had chosen. Hazel Whitaker froze beneath Oral's outstretched paw. The great wolf's amber eyes never left hers, calm despite the chaos surrounding them, as if he understood exactly what she had intended. Above them, the ancient pine groaned again, its roots tearing slowly from the frozen ground. "Pull!" Graham Fletcher shouted until his voice turned raw. Every royal guard leaned backward in perfect unison, boots carving deep trenches through the snow. Callan Westbrook joined them without hesitation, the rope burning across his gloved palms as inch by painful inch the burden began to rise. The ascent was agonizingly slow. Loose ice struck Hazel's shoulders while bitter wind stole every breath. She wrapped one arm around the harness, securing Oral, and clung to the line with the other, refusing to waste what little strength remained. Halfway up the cliff, another section of frozen stone broke free. Graham reacted instantly, driving an iron piton into solid rock and redirecting the line before the falling debris could sever it. The desperate adjustment bought only seconds, but seconds were enough. At last, waiting hands reached over the shattered rim. Two guards caught Oral's harness while Callan himself grasped Hazel beneath her arms and pulled her onto stable ground. She collapsed onto the snow, unable to feel anything except the frantic pounding inside her chest. Oral struggled upright moments later. His injured foreleg trembled, yet instead of remaining beside Callan, the great wolf crossed the frozen ground and lowered himself beside Hazel. He gently pressed his broad head against her shoulder before closing his eyes. Silence spread across the valley. No command had summoned him. No training had taught such loyalty. Every witness understood they were seeing a choice freely made. Derek Hensley's certainty crumbled first. This shouldn't be possible, he murmured, staring at the wolf that had ignored every expectation. Marissa Caldwell looked away, unable to hide the disbelief written across her face. Mabel Crane quietly draped another cloak around Hazel's trembling shoulders before checking the cuts along her hands. "You kept your promise," the old healer whispered. Hazel managed a faint shake of her head. "I only couldn't leave him." Mabel smiled sadly. "Exactly." Callan knelt beside Oral, resting one hand against the great wolf's neck. The familiar bond answered him immediately. The pain remained, but the desperate edge had faded. Looking across to Hazel, He noticed her fingers were stained with dried blood that was not entirely her own, her sleeves torn into makeshift bandages, and the climbing hook he had entrusted to her still fastened securely to the rope. She had protected every life she could before thinking of herself. Rising to his feet, Callan turned toward the assembled search party. "Captain Hensley," he said evenly, "when you believed Oral could not be saved, you chose retreat." Derek lowered his head without offering excuses. Hazel Whitaker saw one breath where the rest of us saw none. No accusation followed. None was necessary. The truth settled more heavily than punishment. Graham quietly ordered fresh stretchers prepared while the remaining guards gathered the scattered equipment. No one looked at Hazel with pity anymore. They stepped around her carefully, offering water, blankets, and respectful silence instead of mockery. Even Jonah Reeves, who had once stood frozen during her humiliation, met her eyes before quietly saying, "I'm sorry." Hazel answered with a tired nod. She had no strength left for resentment. As the expedition slowly formed for the journey home, Oral refused every attempt to lead him elsewhere. He waited until Hazel rose unsteadily to her feet, then walked beside her at the same measured pace. Watching them disappear through the drifting snow, Callan realized the mountains had revealed something greater than a survivor's courage. The Great Wolf had not merely accepted Hazel's kindness. He had chosen to place his trust in her before the eyes of every witness. And once they returned to Frost Pine, that single choice would force the entire pack to confront a truth none of them could deny. The return to Frost Pine felt nothing like the journey that had carried them into the mountains. No one spoke above a whisper. The wind still swept across the valley, but it no longer sounded harsh. It carried the quiet relief of lives that had almost been lost and somehow found their way home. Hazel Whitaker walked slowly through the village gate, her steps unsteady after the long climb from the ravine. Her torn cloak had been wrapped around Oral hours earlier, leaving only Mabel Crane's spare shawl across her shoulders. Beside her, the Great Wolf refused every command to move elsewhere. He matched her pace exactly, slowing whenever she slowed, pausing whenever she paused, until the entire royal escort unconsciously adjusted their march to follow them both. Villagers gathered along the stone road, unable to hide their astonishment. Only that morning they had watched an overlooked Omega kneel in the snow gathering broken herbs, while laughter followed her across the courtyard. Now the oldest guardian of the Northern Crown chose to remain at her side before the eyes of the entire pack. No proclamation could have spoken more loudly. Marissa Caldwell lowered her gaze first. The confidence she had worn like polished armor had quietly disappeared. Derek Hensley stepped from the ranks of the Royal Guards and stopped before Hazel. For several moments he said nothing. Then, with every wolf watching, he removed the captain's insignia from his winter cloak and bowed his head. "I believed strength meant knowing when to abandon the impossible," he said quietly. "You showed me that true courage begins when someone refuses to." Hazel looked at the emblem resting in his hands before gently closing his fingers around it again. "Then wear it," she answered. "Just remember why." Derek nodded once, his eyes carrying a humility they had never held before. Nearby, Jonah Reeves approached with the weathered medicine satchel Hazel had dropped beside the ravine. Snow had melted across the worn leather, yet everything inside had been carefully gathered and restored. "I should have stood beside you sooner," he admitted. Hazel accepted the satchel with a grateful smile. "You came back." It was not forgiveness offered lightly. It was grace freely given. Mabel watched the exchange in silence, her lined face softened by quiet pride. She had spent years protecting a gift Hazel herself had never recognized, never because she feared its power, but because she believed compassion should remain a choice, never a burden. Today, Hazel had made that choice before anyone knew it mattered. Oral suddenly stepped forward, lifting his great head toward the winter sky. His deep howl rolled across Frost Pine, through the forests beyond, and into the distant mountains where the ice ravine lay hidden beneath fresh snow. Wolves throughout the valley answered one after another until the sound became something larger than celebration. It felt like remembrance. Callan Westbrook waited until the echoes faded before walking toward Hazel. In his hands rested the forged climbing hook she had carried into the ravine. Its steel was scarred, the edges worn by stone and ice, yet it had held when every other certainty had begun to fail. Callan placed it gently into her hands. This belonged to generations of kings before me, he said. It always returned to the one who carried it home. Today, it chose differently. Hazel looked down at the weathered iron, then back toward him. I only wanted him to live. I know, Callan replied. That is why it belongs with you. There was no ceremony, no kneeling crowds, no declaration that destiny had solved every question. Instead, Callan offered something far rarer. The Northern Citadel has healers, he said. Warriors, advisors. But it has never had someone the Great Wolf trusted more than fear itself. He paused before continuing. Come with us. Not because anyone commands you, and not because you owe the crown a debt. Come only if the path ahead is one you freely choose. Hazel turned toward Oral. The Great Wolf stepped close enough for her hand to rest once more against the thick silver fur beneath his neck. His steady heartbeat answered beneath her fingertips, strong where hours earlier it had nearly faded into silence. She smiled, not because destiny had finally found her, but because kindness had carried her somewhere she had never imagined walking. Then we begin together, she said softly. As twilight settled across Frost Pine, 3 figures disappeared along the northern road. An alpha king who had learned that authority without compassion could never truly protect a kingdom. A great wolf whose life had been preserved because one ordinary woman refused to surrender hope. And Hazel Whitaker, who had never set out to change the world. She had only refused to let one living soul die alone. In the end, that single decision reached far beyond the ice ravine, reminding every wolf who witnessed it that the strongest hearts are not the ones that never break. They are the ones that still choose to hold on when letting go would be easier.